Hello everyone, welcome to Business School 101. In this video, we're going to discuss some of the ethical issues in international business. Let's start with the fictional scenario. While visiting, an American executive finds that a foreign subsidiary in a poor nation has hired a 12-year-old orphan girl to work on the factory floor. Even though child labor is in direct violation of the company's ethical code, it is quite common in that foreign country. So, if you were the executive in this situation, what would you do? Some of you might say that the practice of hiring child workers should be stopped immediately since it directly violates the company's ethical code. So, let's say that the executive instructs the local manager to replace the child with an adult, and the local manager dutifully complies. Although the executive has followed the firm's ethical code, here's what might happen next. The girl, who is the only breadwinner for herself and her 6-year-old brother, is unable to find another job. Then, out of desperation, she turns to prostitution and therefore exposes herself to dangerous activities like drug use, physical abuse, or the risk of contracting a sexually transmitted disease. In this imaginary story, the visiting executive was faced with an ethical dilemma, which means that none of the available alternatives seemed ethically acceptable. Indeed, in the real business world, managers of multinational corporations sometimes do have to handle different types of ethical dilemmas. To better tackle these difficult problems, business managers need to have a basic idea of what business ethics are, the roots of unethical behavior, and the major philosophical approaches to ethics. The term ethics refers to accepted principles of right and wrong that govern the conduct of a person, the members of a profession, or the actions of an organization. Therefore, business ethics are the accepted principles of right and wrong that govern the conduct of business people. Many of the ethical issues in international business are rooted in the fact that political systems, law, economic development, and culture vary significantly from nation to nation. Nowadays, the most common ethical issues involve employment practices, human rights, environmental regulations, and corruption of multinational corporations. Let's discuss each of these issues individually. First, employment practices. When work conditions in a host nation are clearly inferior to those in a multinational's home nation, what standards should be applied? Those of the home nation, those of the host nation, or something in between? While few would suggest that pay and work conditions should be the same in all countries, how much divergence is acceptable? For example, while 12-hour workdays, extremely low pay, and failure to protect workers against toxic chemicals may be common in some developing nations, does this mean that it is okay for a multinational to tolerate such working conditions in its subsidiaries there, or even to condone it by using local subcontractors? Second, human rights. Questions regarding human rights can arise in international business. Basic human rights are still not respected in many nations. Rights taken for granted in developed countries such as freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom from political repression, and so on, are by no means universally accepted. One of the most obvious historic examples is South Africa during the days of white rule and apartheid, which did not end until 1994. The apartheid system denied basic political rights to the majority non-white population of South Africa, mandated segregation between white and non-white citizens, reserved certain occupations exclusively for white people, and prohibited black people from being placed in positions where they would ever manage white individuals. Third, environmental pollution. Ethical issues also arise when environmental regulations in host nations are inferior to those in the home nation. Many developed countries have substantial regulations governing the emission of pollutants, the dumping of toxic chemicals, the use of toxic materials in the workplace, and so on. Those regulations are often lacking in developing nations. Multinational corporations sometimes do contribute to the global tragedy of the commons by moving production to locations where they are free to pump pollutants into the atmosphere, or dump them into the oceans or rivers, thereby harming valuable resources. While such actions may be legal in some developing countries, are they ethical? Fourth, corruption. Corruption has been a problem in almost every society in history, and it continues to be one today. There always have been and always will be corrupt government officials. International businesses can and have gained economic advantages by making payments to those officials. A classic example concerns a well-publicized incident in the 1970s. Carl Kochian, the president of Lockheed, made a $12.5 million payment to Japanese agents and government officials to secure a large order for Lockheed's TriStar jet from Nippon Air. When the payments were discovered, U.S. officials charged Lockheed with falsification of records and tax violations. Bribery is relatively common in many countries, and bribes often take the form of grease payments, which are small inducements intended to expedite decisions and transactions. For example, in some African countries, grease payments to the custom officials normally can help you avoid the administrative delay for your shipments. Roots of unethical behavior. There is an abundance of examples of managers behaving in a manner that might be deemed unethical in an international business setting. So, why do managers behave in an unethical manner? There is no simple answer to this question because the reasons are too complex, but some generalizations can still be made. Number 1. Personal ethics. Societal business ethics are not divorced from personal ethics, which are the generally accepted principles of right and wrong that govern the conduct of individuals. Our personal ethical codes exert a profound influence on the way we behave as business people. An individual with a strong sense of personal ethics is less likely to behave in an unethical manner in a business setting. Number 2. Decision-making processes. Business people sometimes do not realize that they are behaving unethically, primarily because they simply fail to ask the question, is this decision or action ethical? Instead, they apply a straightforward business calculus to what they perceive to be a business decision, forgetting that the decision may also have an important ethical dimension. The fault lies in processes that do not incorporate ethical considerations into business decision-making. Number 3. Organizational culture. Organizational culture refers to the values and norms that are shared among employees of an organization. Companies should build clear ethical standards and urge their employees to follow them. However, in the real business world, the climate in some businesses might not encourage people to think through the ethical consequences of business decisions. Number 4. Unrealistic performance goals. Sometimes a parent company may pressure managers to meet unrealistic goals that can only be fulfilled by cutting corners or acting unethically. For example, to meet centrally mandated performance goals, managers might give out bribes to win contracts. They may also implement working conditions and environmental controls that are below acceptable standards. Number 5. Leadership. Leaders help establish the culture of an organization, and they set the example that others follow. Other employees in a business often take their cues from business leaders. So, if those leaders do not behave in an ethical manner, then the lower employees might not either. It is not only what leaders say that matters, but also what they do or do not do. Number 6. Societal culture. Culture affects how local values influence global business ethics. There are differences in how much importance various cultures place on specific ethical behaviors. Each individual is influenced by the values, social programming, and experiences encountered from childhood on. These collective factors influence how a person perceives an issue, as well as the related correct or incorrect behaviors. There are 5 major philosophical approaches to business ethics, and each of those philosophical approaches has its own rationale and limitations. First, the Friedman Doctrine. The Friedman view argues that a company's sole responsibility is to maximize profits for its owners or shareholders as long as it is operating within the rule of law. It suggests that improving working conditions beyond the level required by law will reduce profits and is therefore not appropriate. It was first claimed by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman in 1970. Today, the Friedman view has lost popularity because it argues that companies do not have any social obligations. Second, cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is a belief that ethics are nothing more than the reflection of a culture because all ethics are culturally determined. Therefore, a company should adopt local ethics wherever it operates because right and wrong are decided within a cultural context. So, the proverb, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do," captures the essence of this view. However, cultural relativism does not stand up when examined closer. At its extreme, cultural relativism suggests that if a culture supports slavery, then it is okay to use slave labor in a country. Clearly, it is not. Cultural relativism implicitly rejects the idea that universal notions of morality transcend different cultures, but, as we know, some universal notions of morality, such as to seek truth and justice, and to respect fundamental human rights, are found across most cultures. Third, the righteous moralist. The righteous moralist view argues that a company should maintain its home country's ethics wherever it operates because its ethics are superior. If headquarters instructs a subsidiary manager to refrain from bribing local officials, then it imposes its righteous moralist view on the local manager. While this seems reasonable at first, the approach can create problems. The main drawback of the righteous moralist approach is that its proponents often go too far. While there are some universal moral principles that should not be violated, it does not always mean that the appropriate thing is to adopt home country standards. The other problem with the righteous moralist outlook is that it assumes its home country ethics are better than any other host country. However, that is not always the case. Fourth, the naive immoralist. A naive immoralist asserts that if a manager of a multinational sees that firms from other nations are not following ethical norms in a host nation, then that manager should not either. The classic example to illustrate this approach is known as the drug lord problem. In one variant of this problem, an American manager in Colombia routinely pays off the local drug lord to guarantee that his plant will not be bombed, and that none of his employees will be kidnapped. The manager argues that such payments are ethically defensible because everyone else is doing it. The objection is twofold. First, to say that an action is ethically justified if everyone is doing it is not sufficient. Second, a multinational firm does not always have to abide by local practices, and it can decide not to invest in a country where the practices are particularly odious. In other words, the multinational must recognize that it does have the ability to change the prevailing practice in a country. It can use its power for a positive moral purpose. Fifth, the utilitarian. Utilitarian approaches to ethics hold that the moral worth of actions or practices is determined by their consequences. An action is deemed desirable if it leads to the best possible result of good consequences over bad consequences. Utilitarianism is committed to the maximization of good and the minimization of harm. Utilitarianism recognizes that actions have multiple consequences, some of which are good in social sense and some of which are harmful. As a philosophy for business ethics, it focuses its attention on the need to carefully weigh all of the social benefits and costs of a business action, and to only pursue actions that result in the benefits outweighing the costs. The best decisions from a utilitarian perspective are those that produce the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. For all of its appeal, the utilitarian philosophy does have some serious downsides as an approach to business ethics. One problem is measuring the benefits, costs, and risks of a course of action. The second problem is that the philosophy omits the consideration of justice. Actions that produce the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people may result in the unjustified treatment of a minority. Such action cannot be ethical precisely because it is unjust. Now, let's wrap up today's discussion. In this video, we discussed the definition of business ethics, the major ethical issues in the world, the roots of unethical behavior, and 5 major philosophical approaches to business ethics. Do you have any thoughts on business ethics? Have you ever faced some sort of ethical dilemma? Please leave your thoughts in a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.